Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here today supporting this fantastic initiative. We have two of the leading voices in the field who are going to present to you their thoughts first, and then we're going to have a wider debate about some of the challenges, some of the progress, and some of the big themes in terms of getting cookstoves where they're needed. So I'd like to start off by asking Dr. Kandeh, please, to talk to us, and then
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations and President Kim of the World Bank, we want to congratulate the Cookstove Alliance and the UN Foundation for their success over the past 4 years, but also for convening us here today to say we should make energy poverty history, but particularly we make dirty cooking history. The Cookstove Alliance is a part of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative or partnership. Sustainable Energy for All has one goal and 3 targets. Securing sustainable energy for all by 2030. 3 targets, universal access to energy by 2030, which means we want to connect the 1.2 or 1.3 billion that have no access to electricity. We also want to make sure the 2.7 billion that are using biomass for their primary energy fuel, that we can end that as well by 2030. Second target, we want to double the annual rate of improvement of energy efficiency by 2030. And third target, double the share of renewables in the global energy mix. We have just been amazed that our partner Cookstove Alliance is way ahead of all our other partnerships. We're in fact looking at the way they've been able to forge the public-private partnerships, bringing in also civil society as a template that we can use for driving other energy solutions. Of course, to meet their own ambition, that 100 million now by 2017, but probably the 2.7 billion by 2030, we're going to need speed and scale, big scale investments. And of course, that cannot occur outside the broader energy sector reforms. So part of what we are driving in Sustainable Energy for All is broader energy sector reform. In Africa in particular, we say do for the energy sector what you did for mobile telephony. Deregulate, incentivize, government facilitate, but let the private sector do their business properly. And indeed, we saw that private capital came in both domestic and international. So we believe this can be done, and we have many partners in Sustainable Energy for All, and some of the work is already ongoing, and we know we can complement what Radha, Leslie, and Goddess and others are doing in the Cookstove Alliance. Allow me, if I'm biased, and talk about Africa a little bit. I liked what the message the Ghanaians brought today. Minister Tett, thank you very much. The foreign minister was a better marketer of energy solutions than any of us can think about. But the Ghanaians are saying, look, we've discovered oil and gas. That will be part of the solution for clean cooking, but also energy access in a broader sense. We got to do the same. Don't forget that Tanzania and Mozambique may have as much gas or more gas than Kuwait. This is not only for LNG for exports. This should also be used for energy access internally in Ghana. Those are the kinds of solutions we want to promote, big-scale investments, but also looking at bottom-of-the-pyramid solutions. So the last point is, of course, private sector has to play a big role. We see that to achieve the universal access by 2030 or 2035, we need $50 billion of investments per year, globally, per year, going forward. Clean cooking solutions is part of that package. And to do that, that's why we emphasize good public policy, predictable long-term public policy, good incentives, and of course, longevity of those policies. And of course, good de-risking instruments. And I think tomorrow our partners, Cookstove Alliance, will announce what they're trying to do to create this special fund that has some grant money, but also some seed money to get those entrepreneurs going. You need that package. So join the call. In 15 years, when we meet here, Radha, we should be talking about not clean cook stoves anymore, right? That we've already solved the problem. I hope you'll join the campaign. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Yumkella, for that very rousing, very clear, and admirably directed and short presentation. So thank you. And I think you touched on a number of fascinating themes there, not simply about the role of clean cookstoves in the whole climate change and clean energy debate, but also the fascinating initiatives now underway to try and essentially create a new model for bringing in the private sector. And I think the parallels you draw with the mobile phone sector are absolutely fascinating. I'd love to tease that out later on in the conversation. But first of all, I'd like to hear from Keith Hansen from the World Bank about what the World Bank is doing to help support this initiative too.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd just like to begin by saying how exciting it is to be here and how exciting it is that this event is happening at all. This is obviously one of the great development challenges that confronts us today. This is one of the most urgent priorities if we really want to achieve the twin goals of eliminating extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity in a sustainable way, to which the World Bank has recently recommitted itself, and which I think the entire international community shares. The World Bank Group has been working on clean cooking for over 20 years, and some of the partners here today have been working on this for even longer. But I think none of us is satisfied with progress, and with good reason. In the past, we've been hampered by insufficient evidence and a lack of understanding about the impact. We've had inadequate accounting for the linkages to behavior change and the importance of that in taking into account to make things happen. And we've had sporadic involvement by donors that has given inadequate attention to stimulating markets, which are ultimately essential to generating and disseminating technology. The good news, of course, as give evidence by the people in this room, is that things are moving, and they're beginning to move quickly. This progress is being driven by new partnerships, new knowledge, and new action on the ground in a number of places. We obviously now have a true global coalition dedicated to scaling up clean cooking. The Global Alliance is at its center with more than 1,000 partners, but this includes national governments, civil society, academia, UN agencies, other multilaterals, and critically the private sector. And working together is going to be much stronger than any of these working individually. Obviously, clean cooking is also integral to the Sea for All initiative, which we just heard about, and is pivotal to achieving the universal energy access goal. And most important, this is now a truly multi-sectoral effort. You can look around this room and see specialists in energy, in health, and technology, in gender, finance, poverty issues, and environment, all of which are crucial to making this happen. How are we going to do this? Well, first we're applying what we've learned over the years. We know that no matter how a household obtains clean cooking, whether through purchase or giveaway, we're not going to achieve the long-term goals of adoption if these are not well suited to people's needs. And it's going to take a vast and varied effort to scale up to the actions to the level that we need. We know that for many countries and many regions, the use of traditional biomass is not going away. In fact, it's projected that it's actually going to rise to 3.4 billion people by 2020. So anything we do has to adapt to that reality and realize that it's not going to be fast to get beyond that. But we know that there is a huge potential market for clean cooking solutions. The World Bank estimates that the market for clean cookstoves may be as high as $6 billion, and for clean cooking fuels is many times that value. But awareness raising, financing, standards, affordability, and effective distribution networks remain major barriers, and that's what we need to address if we want to achieve these goals. This is why governments, donors, civil society, and the private sector all have crucial and complementary roles to play. For instance, the private sector is obviously essential in manufacturing and distribution of clean cooking technology for urban and peri-urban communities, and for remote communities and the poorest, the public sector and nonprofit sectors have to continue to be in the lead, with the private sector involvement growing as supply chains are strengthened. The two working in complement are going to ensure that we can bring everyone along at the same pace. We know that demand for more efficient and cleaner cooking is starting to grow, driven partly by the increasing cost of traditional biomass, but also by movements such as this. Thanks to the Global Alliance's research and outreach, governments are recognizing the need for action. Consumer demand and clearer standards are helping to spur innovation, and a nascent industry is now emerging to produce new kinds of cookstoves, and private sector financing is a crucial element in that. Given all of this knowledge and progress, I'm excited that the World Bank Group is engaged as never before in this, and that we'll be scaling up our work in the area of efficient clean cooking and heating, as well as and working closely with the Global Alliance. Tomorrow we'll be announcing the details of how we're going to put more of our financial and convening muscle behind this effort, But just to give a flavor, our work with the Global Alliance is going to focus on country support activities, including helping to develop policies, standards, and testing, capacity building for supply chain enterprises, entrepreneurs, local financing institutions, and building greater awareness at both government and household levels. We're going to work with our partners to develop new financing mechanisms and to mobilize funding to help expand access to efficient and clean cooking technologies. And one exciting aspect of an upcoming area of work is to work more on remote monitoring, using sensors on stoves and in households to help us better understand stove use, black carbon emissions, and exposure to pollution, and therefore the potential impact of these various tools. The International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, is also going to play a key role. IFC is going to create and support investment and project development vehicles to bring greater private sector involvement into this space, and thus demonstrate how the World Bank Group is working as never before as a whole to promote development solutions. Our scaled-up effort is going to build on our considerable country knowledge and experience from all partners. And this includes our current work in areas such as the Indonesia Clean Stove Initiative, where we're working with government to introduce affordable biomass-fueled cook stoves to 25 million Indonesian households. The Central America Clean Cooking Initiative, which is developing investment prospectuses and roadmaps to reach universal access by 2030. And in China, where a $120 million World Bank loan is supporting nearly 500,000 households in 5 provinces to install biogas cooking systems. We also, of course, need to continue supporting and enabling small-scale efforts to scale up and contribute more toward achieving the ambitious goals. We see partnerships at the global and local level as essential, and we look forward to strengthening these. As I was preparing for this event, it occurred to me that there's recently been a strong case made that cooking is literally what made us human. By liberating our bodies from the arduous duty of spending hours a day processing large amounts of raw food, cooking enabled us to redirect that energy and build the huge disproportionate brains that distinguish us from all the other primates. So it is both ironic and tragic that today, this most human of activity that once built our capacity is now actually undermining the capacity, the human capacity of women and children and others around the world, as well as the carrying capacity of the planet. So let's put these big brains that cooking gave us to use together to solve this problem, which we are now confident we can do. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ms. Hansen. And I think you make a very good point there about cooking being universal and absolutely fundamental to who we are as humans. And that's one reason why this whole initiative is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I personally am delighted to be here championing this because I've had a very schizophrenic life myself. For the last few years, I've been running the Financial Times operations in North America. But I actually originally trained as an anthropologist and worked for several years in communities in Western China and Pakistan and then Tajikistan. And so I've lived with women, I've gone out and collected dung myself and cooked with it. And so I know how fundamental it is to people's lives. So I've always hoped to find a way to connect those two sides of my life, and I'm delighted that you are actually doing that. So I'd like to start by asking you both, how do you feel about trying to bring together the public and private sector? How is it working out in practice? Is this creating any challenges? Because, of course, the culture of the public and private sectors are very different indeed. And traditionally, many aid groups, many development groups have been very wary of working too closely with the private sector. Who would like to go first?
It's been very challenging. My experience 5 years ago when I really started doing this energy advocacy more vigorously, I remember having meetings with CEOs of companies and I was preaching about people's right to energy. And you know, they will listen to me and tolerate me for about an hour and a half. And then they will nicely say, Mr. Yumkella, we talk about value propositions. That's how we report to our shareholders. So we know it's a right, but what's the business proposal? So I learned very quickly that it is about markets. And so this is why I also commend the Cookstoves Alliance, that they're focusing on developing markets. Second, I realized that for energy access in developing countries, political risk issues are really serious because these are long-term investments. And because some of these markets do not have good institutions to also help regulate the markets, the private sector would insist on de-risking capital. So again, we're spending a lot of time now looking at instruments for de-risking. The public policy may be there, but because they have worries about the long term and the political changes, they may not still bring investments. And finally, cost. How do we lower the costs for various technologies we want to bring in? We see that a lot in the renewables energy debates, cost of storage, cost of renewables, but also integrating new technology into some of the infrastructure that is there. So again, this is why I said the Cookstove solutions must also be integrated in the wider, broader energy sectoral reforms.
Right. I'm going to ask Keith's opinion in a second. Before I do that, though, I mean, in your conversations that you've had with the private sector, with the representatives of companies, and we saw earlier 3 companies highlighted that are involved, do you find you have the same time horizons, the same planning horizons as the companies? And what, for the most part, do they want to get out of it from you? And is there a way to make those interests compatible?
I think that in the energy access space, they seem to have similar horizons as public sector. It is obvious to those investors that if they come in, they have to stay 15, 20 years or longer. However, it is also true that sometimes the politicians, they're still thinking 4-year or 5-year electoral cycles. This is why the whole issue of the longevity of the regulatory environment or the public policy and incentives that have been provided by one government needs to stay longer. And so private sector, whether it's the banks or the technology companies, will tell you we need TLC, transparency, longevity, credibility of public policy. If you give us that, we'll assess the risks and determine whether to go in. So yeah, there is sometimes the tension between that longevity and the 4-year political cycle of the politicians.
Right. Keith, how have you found it in terms of dealing with this rather innovative approach to trying to blend public and private sectors?
Private and public sector involvement is essential to ending poverty. And there is no way to achieve this unless both sectors are involved and unless they are working in synergy together. This is a simple fact, and this is what is driving the recent reorganization within the World Bank Group to bring all the different parts of the group much more closely together, including the World Bank and IFC, our private sector arm. Each plays an essential complementary role. Each does something that the other cannot, and the two of them together have a multiplicative effect that either of them trying to work individually would not achieve. There are obviously large problems with either of them working independently, but when they work together, it's much better. And this is what we're hearing from our client countries, that they want to see much more engagement on both sides. The truth is the private sector provides an enormous amount of the services, even to the very poorest. And until now, development policies often tended to overlook that or to focus only on other parts of the equation. But our leverage and our impact would be so much greater if we engage in a constructive way, which is what we and so many others here are now trying to do.
So just to quickly clarify for the benefit of the audience who may not know the ins and outs of World Bank reorganisation, essentially what you're doing at the moment is bringing together the private sector arm, the IFC, to work more closely with the traditional multilateral arm, the World Bank. How is that affecting this particular initiative?
Well, it's going to affect it in a very helpful way because in this way, when we work with a country, we can work in an integrated fashion where the World Bank side will take the lead in engaging with government about the things that public sector needs to do to establish a conducive policy and regulatory environment and the catalytic factors that can attract investment. And the IFC can work to create a policy environment, find potential on entry investments, and work with the private sector that is interested in this and to try to bring the development aspects to the bank side as well. So working together, we see this and in many other areas as potentially very powerful. And in addition, on the bank side, we have also brought all the sectors together now in a way that they never were before. So this initiative is led by our energy practice, but it also involves our environment, climate change, health, and other practices, recognizing that all of them have a role to play, both in advocating this and in delivering on it.
So as someone who's been involved with the World Bank and multilateral organisations for some time, can you think of any other initiative which has had a similar level of sort of engagement from both the public and the private sector in this way? I mean, is there a pilot project or a playbook that you're looking to for this?
I think less than looking at a pilot playbook, we have to look at each issue in its own terms. And I mean, it's clear that in any country that has overcome a development challenge, there has been an effort to bring the private sector in an appropriate way, in part because this enables the public sector to focus on the poorest that tend not to be reached by markets, and eventually private sector initiative can also reach the poorest. So in this case, we have to look at the specifics of the situation to find how this is going to best work. But it's sometimes perilous to try to pick something else and just apply it mechanically to another sector because everything is so specific. And in this case, maybe doubly so because of the challenges we still face, the gulf between what's affordable today and the technologies of the future.
Right. And in terms of trying to reach out and getting more private sector investment in this project, I mean, what do you think are the key issues right now? Do you want a lot more social funds, social impact investing to come into the sector?
We have strongly advocated, first of all, with our traditional donors, and I'm happy many of them are here, to prioritize energy access. Energy access as an enabler of all the other sustainable development goals. That initial allocation of official development assistance to energy is going to be crucial. You need that money to build capacities in the countries, in the developing countries. Training, public policy reforms, the necessary legislations and so on. Private sector is not going to do that. Many of these countries may not have the skills required to really reform or build the energy sector. So you need some of that public money. Second category is also getting what I mentioned, some of the capital you require to develop the project pipelines. I came here from Germany, so meeting with some donors now, discussing project development facilities. We recognize that in the energy space in particular, it takes quite a while to develop projects, from pre-feasibility study, feasibility study, environmental impact assessment, and all of those pre-investment stages cost money. In a few cases, the private sector will take the chance to do that. But if we're looking at bottom of the pyramid solutions, you need that seed capital, and you'll see again why, in fact, the Cookstove Alliance is arguing for that fund. And I hope many of you will pledge, because it's not easy to develop those projects. It's not easy to do the hand-holding for the energy entrepreneurs. And we have some other partners in this room, the Energy and Resources Institute of India, that is going to be a capacity building hub. We have an NGO here, Energia, who are trying to do this at the ground level. It's more complicated in the energy space. If you take Cookstoves, many of the private companies tell me, look, would love to do this, but we're worried about the safety issues. So those issues about standardization, especially for LPG. I see Kimball Chen is in the room. We're trying to partner even with the Global LPG Association to say, look, you have the technical expertise. Can we bring you in very early in some countries to help even with the sector planning, to help with the standardization and capacity building? In other words, you, the private sector, also be the market creator in that sense.
And just from that interest, when you are getting the private sector investing as funds, is most of that money coming from the Western private sector? Are you seeing any sign of the money coming from the emerging markets as well on the private sector?
For now, it is still Western capital. Of course, we're trying to promote South-South.
Right.
I'll be advocating for that in China in 3 weeks' time.
I mean, you have a lot of billionaires out there right now who are in the South too.
We're doing the same in India. We're doing quite a bit of South-South with India. Because some of the basic solutions we need in Asia, some of those are already being applied in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in India, for example.
Right.
So there is a huge opportunity here for South-South cooperation. If you take one of the cookstoves that is being assembled now in Lesotho, the original design by Philips was in India. And I just saw one of those with the CEO of Philips, that was the CEO that was managing the factory to do energy efficient bulbs. And we worked with him to build a factory to assemble the same cookstove in Lesotho. So that South-South dimension is important.
Right, because it does strike me that this could be a very natural area where you could actually see a lot of homegrown innovation, South innovation, even reverse innovation coming back into the West. And you could actually tap a lot of local pools of capital in a way that, I mean, the great thing about cookstoves is that this is not a political or religious issue. It's something very basic, as you said, Mr. Hansen earlier, that is something everyone needs, and that many South philanthropists and entrepreneurs could actually get behind backing too.
Well, I noticed also with LPG, I mean, we've looked at the story of the success in Malaysia. Petronas played a key role over 15 years to develop that market before the other oil companies and others came into the market. So again, here, I think we need to emphasize that you still need a significant role of the developmental state or some degree of market development. I use the terrible S word, some degree of subsidization too, to get the market really at a point where you can crowd in even more private sector. So there is a good lesson on LPG to learn from Malaysia and what Petronas had to do over almost 2 decades to give confidence to other private international players to join the LPG business in that country, distribution, but also production of the canisters and also the pipelines in the homes.
Fascinating. And I mean, Keith, Hansen, in terms of the drive to create the regulatory framework and the standards, which of course the World Bank is very involved with, how easy is it to create commonly accepted standards?
Well, it's not the bank's place to create them itself. The ISO has been engaged in this, which is going to be extremely helpful to agreeing on a common standard. Just last week, WHO introduced the standards for what constitutes clean, which are very helpful. The bank's job is really to support the countries in coming up with the standards that are going to be recognizable, reasonably uniform, and that are going to attract the kind of investment activity and level playing field that's necessary at that level. We've done this in many other markets over the years. We've done it obviously in financial markets. We do it in systems across the different parts of government. And it's not so much us necessarily applying expertise as it is helping the countries to access the expertise and increasingly learn from one another. And then you get a kind of snowball effect where the more countries who do it, the easier it is for successive countries to do it. And then you begin to get a mass market signal that can attract both attention and start generating useful lessons of experience that others can apply.
Right. And given that it's really the women who are primarily cooking and exposed to these fumes and dangers, but also given that in many communities around the world, the women are not the ones who actually control the money, are you looking at innovative ways of partnering up with, say, women's organizations or microcredit organizations to provide the financing for communities to actually buy these cook stoves?
Yes, I think it's important that we engage all segments of society in this, and particularly at the household level. Everything we do now with households, it's essential to understand the dynamics within the household and within the community itself. Social assessments play a much bigger part now in much of the development thinking that the bank does and supports. And in particular at the household level, we've had very good success now with things in the social sectors, such as conditional cash transfers, where the money is actually given to the woman in the household against measurable outputs that then determine whether the money continues to flow. This is a form of results-based finance that we think holds promise in this area as well as some others.
So the woman has to prove that she actually spent it on a cook stove or something useful rather than have it taken by her husband or brother or somebody else and gambled away or drunk or something.
Right, that's exactly right.
But I think also you need the women in the design of the cook stoves and other appliances.
Right.
I have seen that done in India, in Gujarat, by the Self-Employed Women's Association. I have seen a number of cook stoves and other things. They had to get the producer, the manufacturer, to modify, because the way it was designed did not go with the pots they were using, and did not also go with their cultural practices. So I think for this particular subject, women better be in the R&D room when the guys are designing the engineering of that stuff. Otherwise it will not sell. And you will not be addressing some of the real needs they have. Even the position of the handles. Right. I've actually seen that again in India.
How interesting. Do you have women engineers involved? I can see some people in the audience nodding enthusiastically at this point, which is very encouraging. But are there women engineers involved in actually designing this? I mean, because it would be great to hear about that.
It doesn't necessarily have to be women engineers. It is almost like a consumer testing. Mm-hmm. You call them into the room, do a prototype and say, will this work? Right at that early stage when you just have the first prototype. But yes, it will really help a lot if the women, in fact, were the one designing. But I think we should be careful with that as well. As he said, it's we the guys who make the decision. So the more men we see in the campaign for Clean Cookstoves in some of the developing countries, the better. Because that means they got the message.
Right.
But on this point, obviously there are many micro enterprises at work in these countries that are already manufacturing different types of these, and in some ways these have been the pioneers in efforts to progress toward clean cooking, and many of those involve women. And as our colleague from Kenya said earlier, this can be an important source of local income and entrepreneurship. So it's important to do it at all these levels, in design, in how the finance flows when we do need social investment, but also in the running of the firms themselves, however large or small.
Right. Well, you've mentioned a couple of interesting examples from Africa and also Malaysia. Are there any other great stories you've seen on the ground where you've been very encouraged by what's happening? We were talking earlier about, the use of M-Pesa in Kenya to try and support people buying these stoves.
Well, again, if you look at some of the successes now with connecting distribution of solar lights with mobile payment systems, maybe the Cookstove Alliance can look at that. Because I see a lot of those experiments now in Kenya, Rwanda, and other places also linked to microfinance. But that possibility to pay by mobile phone, we are looking at that very closely for distribution of solar lighting. Right. So this will be an important element here. But I also know that my colleagues at the World Bank, who are partners with us, are working in Nicaragua and Honduras and Guatemala on these same questions. So there are some lessons we can learn from Latin America as well. Brazil also, because Brazil has been pushing energy access as a way of social inclusion. Right. Not just energy for the sake of energy, but it's what it enables. So I think there are models in Brazil that may be also useful.
Right. Well, someone who used to live with women who were not able to physically walk around that much from their villages. I mean, the beauty of mobile phone payments is you can actually buy things from a distance without having to actually travel as a woman, which is critical.
Or a relative can pay for you.
Yes, or a relative can pay for you, or better still, you can pay for it and no one else in your family will necessarily even know, which is often very important when you've got power relations inside a family network. But Keith, do you have any particular stories from the world that you'd like to share with us in terms of great success stories or encouraging examples?
Actually, what I'd rather do is pick up the last point you made about mobile phones. We often think of these as a way to reach people in remote areas, but it's equally or more important that they can now reach us. They can reach the firms, they can reach the policymakers, they can reach those who deliver the services to give real-time feedback on what's working and what isn't, whether they're using things, whether they're accessing the services. It's an important accountability mechanism for both the public and private sector. And I think this is a great untapped potential that we're really looking forward to seeing. This is as our colleague said earlier, it's another version of a leapfrog technology that is going to revolutionize how we know whether things are actually working or not. Back to your earlier point of making sure that things are appropriately designed and are taking behaviors into account. I think that, and there we are seeing a number of potential uses there which could be very important in this area where we are really trying to reach, in many cases, the poorest of the poor.
So mobile phones are actually being used as a data collection tool to enable better project design and greater social participation rather than simply allowing people to pay money in that respect.
Absolutely. Not just design, but implementation, and to make course corrections throughout, and even to hold policymakers accountable. In some countries, people are using mobile phones to say whether or not the teacher showed up in class, and this is a very powerful signal and incentive, obviously.
Right. Well, maybe we could import some of those ideas to America as well, but that'd be interesting. But we're almost out of time. But I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the project's obviously launched. You're doing very interesting pioneering work in terms of bringing together public and private, trying to build markets, trying to get Western capital involved in a private sector manner. But what really needs to happen now to take this from a fascinating pilot, a fascinating project, into something that's actually going to change change the environment, but change the lives of millions of people? Because, as you've just said earlier, Dr. Yumkella, on current trajectory, the number of people in the world who are dependent on biomass will go from 2.7 billion to 3.4 billion by 2020, and yet you're also talking about trying to stop people from using biomass altogether. So how on earth do you take that 3.4 billion, if I've got my sums right, how do you take that 3.4 billion and actually persuade them to stop using biomass or use cleaner biomass and start using electrical or whatever other method instead? Because that's an awful lot of people. How do you scale up?
Probably we don't have to stop them using it. We have to incentivize them to switch, which means the technology is available, which means also that the markets are working. So what we plan to do to support what the Cookstove Alliance is doing now is to launch major campaigns globally in the countries where we need some of these public policy reforms and awareness. And we're going to work with what we call the Practitioners Network. We have 1,800 NGOs registered. We're going to work with Energia. We're doing side meetings while we're here to launch that campaign in a number of countries. Hopefully we'll start about 30 with our partners, about half of those in Africa. In addition, we want to do campaigns, hopefully led by DFID, Minister Featherstone, who was left, but also Greening, are all committed to the global campaign on energy, women and children's health. Because remember, we are only talking cookstoves. There's another dimension here. Lack of energy in hospitals and the high maternal mortality rates. Lack of energy and then a lot of infections because you don't have access to clean water. Yeah. So we're very pleased that DFID is building a coalition for us to launch that campaign globally, to say that by the time you look at how energy begins to touch the other social sector indicators or human development indicators, you realize that we have a big problem in our hands. So one of the ways to get these bigger policy changes we need, we're going to launch major campaigns now. Of course, we're looking at even additional financing instruments. Thirdly, we're encouraging countries now in the energy sector planning to include the energy access and clean cookstove dimension. And my colleagues are here from the World Bank. We have about 10 countries where we're doing that sector planning now, but embedding cookstove and clean cooking in the middle of that. So it's multifaceted if you want to scale up, but you can't run away from that predictable, clear market condition that will bring in the big investments. Otherwise, we'll still stay at the pilot stage.
Right, fascinating. Keith?
And to that, I agree with all of that, and I would add the other thing is we need to continue to amass and use the evidence as rigorous as possible on the impacts on, obviously, on efficiency, on the climate to the extent that we can, and on human health. And we're at different stages of, rigor and robustness of this evidence. But evidence now is essential in a world where everybody carries a computer in their pocket and big data is becoming the norm. The issues with the best evidence are the ones that are going to be funded and supported and invested in, not necessarily the best issues, but those who have the best evidence. And this happens to be both. It's a clear imperative issue, and we need the evidence. And in addition to that, we need good monitoring and evaluation of impacts, which can then justify the investments that countries need to make to get this started, the effort they need to make to induce the private sector, and the private sector to realize, yes, if we come in, there will be a market because the public sector sees that this is imperative to reaching their goals. And I can't stress enough these days how much evidence drives decision making, much more so than in the past.
Well, thank you. You make a very good point there, which is, never before in human history have we had such extraordinary tools at our disposal to mobilize people, to reach people, to really change people's lives. And yet never before in history have we had so many people who need to be reached and who have not yet been reached. And that's both the inspiration and the challenge. And I just say from my own point of view, when I was an anthropologist in Tajikistan in the mountains, every 3 days I used to sit with the women and cook bread and slap the bread against the walls of the oven. And we were using very, very traditional fuels. And we used to worry a lot about getting burnt. We used to worry a lot about the bread falling into the fire. We never once talked about what the fuel that we were burning would actually mean to us or anyone else around us or the environment. So from a personal point of view, and all the women I used to live with, I certainly salute what you're doing. Wish you the very best of luck. I can see many of you in the audience nodding enthusiastically as these issues have been discussed, and I'm sure many of you have fantastic stories to tell, and I would urge you to tell them. And I'd just like to say from the bottom of my heart a very big thank you to you both for a very interesting discussion, and thank you to all of you who are supporting this project. So thank you.